There are records that survive because the institution preserved them carefully, and there are records that survive because a disturbance remained private only long enough for those nearest it to realize that private explanation was no longer holding. The second kind is always more difficult because houses do not record themselves. Families do not testify with uniform discipline. And when an event passes through memory, then through retelling, then through publication, what survives is rarely perfect certainty. It is sequence repeated enough, stable enough, persistent enough that later doubt cannot fully erase the fact that something forced ordinary people to continue describing it. In the autumn of 1878, Amherst was not a place prepared to enter unusual record. It was a functioning provincial town, shaped by labor, rail movement, timber, local trade, and the ordinary discipline of households built around practical necessity. By that decade, Amherst had become increasingly linked to wider regional exchange. Rail traffic gave the town movement beyond merely local rhythm. Work defined daily expectation. People knew where others were employed. When families changed routine, when illness entered a house, when labor ceased unexpectedly. It was not large enough for privacy to hold easily, nor small enough to be described as remote. Its houses reflected the practical domestic agreements common to working communities of the period. Rooms served more than one purpose. Each gathered unevenly. Beds were often arranged according to family rather than privacy. fills divided space, but not always. Sound, a raised voice, a heavy footstep, a falling object. These were rarely confined to one room. Nothing in such houses suggested theatrical isolation. That matters because later retellings often weaken domestic records by granting them atmosphere they did not require. The Amherst house entered history not because it appeared unusual before disturbance, but because ordinary domestic life continued there long enough that repeated interruption became increasingly difficult to dismiss. At the center of the surviving account stands Esther Cox. She lived within an extended family shaped by practical dependence rather than unusual circumstance. The household included relatives whose routines overlapped closely. Daily life was shared. Personal distress did not remain private for long because proximity made concealment difficult. That detail matters because nearly every later interpretation of Amherst returns to Esther's condition before the disturbances began. Accounts later preserved repeatedly state that she had recently endured severe emotional distress. The most frequently repeated version holds that she had suffered a violent fright connected to an attempted assault not long before the earliest disturbances entered family memory. That account survives strongly enough that it cannot honestly be removed from chronology. But constitutional restraint requires equal honesty. The detail survives primarily through later transmission, especially through published accounts, rather than through a fully independent legal record. So the record keeps it where it belongs, not as settled proof, but as part of the known human condition surrounding the first of events. What remains stable is that Esther's agitation was noticed. Those around her observed nervous strain, periods of visible distress, a body already under pressure before the house itself drew attention. The fact later became central to skeptical interpretations and therefore belongs fully within the sequence. The earliest disturbances began at night. A bedroom, a family nearby, no dramatic isolation, no house, yet understood as unusual. The first interruption entered record through sound. Accounts differ in exact wording, but several preserve one common feature. The sound came from near the bed, not distant, in another room, not overhead, close enough that attention turned immediately toward furniture. The first reaction was not fear. It was inspection. That distinction remains central to Amherst because the earliest witnesses behaved exactly as ordinary people behave. When a 19th century wooden house produces unexplained knocks, wood shifts, boards answer changing temperature, furniture that moves against uneven flooring. Nothing required mystery. One sound carried little meaning. Then another followed, and then another. Some later versions sharpen these into dramatic blows. The more stable sequence is simpler, repeated knocks, sharp enough to interrupt conversation, near enough that those present looked directly beneath the bed. In inspection followed. The mattress was checked, the frame examined, the floor beneath looked at directly, because everyone still believed something simple would reveal itself if properly searched. Witness begins in inspection that must remain central. Only after inspection fails does a disturbance acquire weight beyond inconvenience. Nothing sufficient was found. The room remained ordinary. The furniture remained where expected. Yet the sounds returned, and then came slight, visible motion. Again, later accounts differ in degree. The strongest share core remains that the bed answered repeated knocks with movement visible enough to be noticed by more than one person. Not violent, not yet. Enough that attention shifted from hearing to watching. At this stage, the room had not become impossible. It had become difficult, and difficulty is where enduring records begin, because ordinary explanation had failed once, but had not yet surrendered. The sounds returned on later nights, not continuously, not in uninterrupted violence, but often enough that house inside began waiting for them. This marks the first real change in domestic life, because hearing may be accidental. Waiting is behavioral change. Once silence itself becomes watched, the room has already altered. The disturbances then widened beyond sound alone. Bedding reportedly shifted. The disturbances then widened beyond even that. Bedding reportedly shifted. The frame shook more visibly. Several accounts preserve that Esther herself appeared increasingly distressed during these episodes, sometimes rising suddenly, sometimes reacting before others heard the next sound. This detail later strengthened opposing interpretations in equal measure. To some, it suggested central witness sensitivity. To others, it suggested that her own condition may have shaped what followed. The ledger preserves both possibilities because both belong to the surviving record. The household did not immediately invite public attention. For a time, family members remained the principal witnesses, but repetition weakened privacy. Neighbors entered, not crowds, not immediate spectacle, simply the natural widening that occurs when repeated disturbances inside a nearby house become difficult to ignore. Those who entered did so first as practical observers, to hear, to check, to stand near the bed where sounds were said to begin. That widening matters because Amherst survives not as solitary testimony, but because more than one person remained willing to state that something in that room resisted easy explanation. Reports now include louder knocks, movement affecting nearby objects, household items shifting position. Again, caution is required. Later retellings often intensify sequence beyond what appears most stable. What survives repeatedly is enough. Objects moved visibly enough that witnesses no longer confined explanation to furniture settling. At this stage, the house ceased belonging entirely to family memory. It became local fact, not proven fact, but facts enough that more people arrived expecting to judge for themselves. And this is where Walter Hubble enters the surviving record. Hubble was not a distant historian. He was a local actor who became physically present in the house. That distinction matters because Amherst survives largely through him. He later published the account that preserved most of what is now known publicly as the Great Amherst Mystery. Without Hubble, Amherst likely weakens drastically in historical memory. But because Amherst survives through Hubble, caution must remain constant. He is both source and shaper of source. He observed, he recorded, he also arranged those observations into a narrative built for publication. The ledger therefore treats him neither as neutral authority nor as disposable witness. He belongs fully in the record, but never above it. Hubble later described nights in which sound intensified in his presence, knocking from walls, movement of objects, visible disturbances, difficult in his account to assign to simple cause. He claimed that furniture shifted, noises answered speech, and the disturbances occurred while several observers remained present. His writing preserves these sequences with confidence. Later readers have not always granted that confidence equally. That tension remains part of Amherst itself. The more witnesses entered, the more the house acquired reputation, and reputation changes witness behavior. This too must remain visible, because once a house becomes known locally, every later sound enters a room already carrying expectation. The most widely preserved single event came with fire. Accounts across major tellings agree that Esther's clothing ignited suddenly during one disturbance. Witnesses were present. The fire was seen. The immediate reaction was practical and immediate. Extinguish it. Exact ignition detail varies across telling. Some place emphasis on sudden flame without clear source. Others leave room for less dramatic explanation. What remains stable is narrower and therefore stronger. A visible fire occurred in association with Esther during the Amherst disturbances and entered witness memory strongly enough to remain one of the case's most repeated moments. That event widened attention further because sound may still invite doubt. Fire compels reaction, and once physical danger enters the record, the house no longer remains merely unusual. It becomes difficult. Hubble continued observing, writing later that disturbances persisted across multiple occasions, sometimes in his own direct presence, sometimes through reports given to him by others nearby. But as Amherst expanded in retelling, another constitutional rule becomes necessary. Not every preserved incident carries equal evidentiary strength. The earliest family observations hold one kind of weight. Hubble's direct observations hold another. Later retellings hold less. The ledger therefore preserves strongest where witness density remains nearest event. At a certain point, Esther left the original household temporarily. This movement matters because many cases weaken once removed from original setting. Reports suggest disturbances did not end immediately with relocation. Some later accounts describe continuation in lesser or altered form, but here certainty thins, so the record states only what the surviving evidence permits. Reports suggest continuation beyond the original house, but surviving descriptions are less uniform than the earliest Amherst nights. That uncertainty must remain visible. Eventually, what had begun as knocks near a bed ceased to function as an active local event and became printed memory. This is why Amherst survived, not because verdicts arrived, because publication fixed sequence before it disappeared. Hubble's book ensured endurance. Later psychical literature adopted the case. Skeptics revisited it. Psychological readings emerged. Fraud was proposed. Trauma was proposed. Misinterpretation was proposed. None erased the original difficulty entirely. Too many ordinary actions still remain inside the earliest sequence. People heard, looked, checked, waited, listened again. That pattern survives stronger than any final explanation. And perhaps that is why Amherst remains difficult, even now, not because certainty survived, because certainty never fully replaced sequence. A room, a bed, a family, still expecting ordinary explanation, one inspection longer than comfort allowed. What is recorded remains. The record remembers.